Your Honor, I understand the severity of this crime, but he's just a child. He's only 15 years old. The defense attorney's voice cracked as she spoke, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the podium. The courtroom fell silent except for the soft sobbing coming from the gallery where family members sat in stunned disbelief. Judge Patricia Hawthorne looked down at the defendant, a teenager who sat motionless at the defense table, his head bowed, showing no emotion as his fate was about to be decided. The weight of what had transpired over the past 4 years hung heavy in the air like a suffocating blanket. This court has reviewed all the evidence, heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, and considered the psychological evaluations submitted by both the prosecution and defense. Judge Hawthorne began, her voice steady but filled with the gravity of the moment. The defendant, Marcus Caldwell, age 15 at the time of the crime, has been found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his mother, Rebecca Caldwell, who was 7 months pregnant with what would have been his baby sister. The judge paused, allowing the full impact of her words to settle over the courtroom. The crime was not committed in a moment of passion or teenage rebellion. The evidence shows this was a calculated, premeditated act carried out with full knowledge of the consequences. Marcus Caldwell researched methods of killing, planned the timing to ensure he would not be caught, and showed no remorse in the aftermath of his actions. The courtroom erupted in gasps and muffled cries as Judge Hawthorne continued. Given the heinous nature of this crime, the premeditation involved, and the complete lack of remorse shown by the defendant, this court sentences Marcus Caldwell to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the packed courtroom, sealing the fate of a teenager who had destroyed his own family and shocked a nation with his cold-blooded actions. On the evening of September 14, 2015, in the affluent suburb of Millbrook Heights, a quiet community 30 miles outside of Chicago, Illinois, what appeared to be a tragic accident would soon reveal itself as one of the most shocking family murders in recent memory. The Caldwell family lived in a sprawling colonial home on Maple Ridge Drive, a tree-lined street where children rode bicycles on sidewalks and neighbors knew each other by name. Thomas Caldwell, a prominent state senator known for his work on education reform and family values legislation, had built what seemed to be the perfect life with his wife Rebecca, a former elementary school teacher who had dedicated herself to raising their son Marcus and preparing for the arrival of their second child. Rebecca Caldwell, 38 years old and 7 months pregnant, had spent that Tuesday evening preparing dinner and helping Marcus with his homework, just as she had done countless times before. The house smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread, the kind of warm, inviting atmosphere that Rebecca had always worked to create for her family. Marcus, a sophomore at Millbrook Heights High School, had seemed like any other 15-year-old that evening, discussing his upcoming history test and complaining about his English teacher's strict grading policies. Thomas was in Springfield for a late legislative session, something that had become routine during the busy fall session, leaving Rebecca and Marcus alone in the house they had called home for over a decade. At approximately 9:30 that evening, neighbors reported hearing what sounded like a loud crash coming from the Caldwell residence, followed by shouting that quickly turned to silence. Margaret Chin, who lived directly across the street, later told police that she had been watching television when she heard what she described as furniture being overturned and someone calling for help. The sounds lasted only a few minutes before everything went quiet, which she found strange enough to peer out her front window toward the Caldwell house. The lights were on in the kitchen and living room, and she could see movement through the windows, but nothing that seemed immediately alarming. Mrs. Chin, a retired nurse who had known the Caldwell family since they moved to the neighborhood, decided not to call police at that time, later expressing deep regret about her decision to wait and see if anything else happened. The emergency call came at 10:47 that evening when Marcus Caldwell dialed 911 from his family's landline, his voice shaking as he spoke to the dispatcher. "My mom fell down the stairs," he said, his words coming in short, panicked bursts. "She's not moving and there's blood everywhere. Please send an ambulance right away." The dispatcher, Jennifer Walsh, a 10-year veteran of the emergency services, immediately dispatched paramedics and police to the Caldwell residence while keeping Marcus on the line. "Can you check if your mother is breathing?" Jennifer asked, her training taking over as she guided the teenager through basic first aid steps. Marcus responded that he was too scared to get close to his mother, that there was too much blood, and that he thought she might be dead. The call lasted 8 minutes and 12 seconds, during which Marcus provided his address, confirmed that he was alone in the house with his mother, and repeatedly asked when help would arrive. Millbrook Heights police officer David Martinez was the first to arrive at the scene at 10:52 that evening, followed closely by Paramedic Unit 7 and Detective Sarah Kim from the County Sheriff's Department. Officer Martinez found the front door unlocked and Marcus waiting in the living room, sitting on the edge of the sofa with his head in his hands. The teenager appeared to be in shock, his clothes disheveled and his hands visibly shaking as he pointed toward the staircase where his mother lay motionless. Rebecca Caldwell was found at the bottom of the main staircase, her body positioned in a way that initially appeared consistent with a fall from the top of the stairs. She was unconscious, bleeding from a severe head wound, and showed no signs of life when paramedics began their assessment. The scene was immediately secured as a potential crime scene, standard procedure in cases involving unexplained deaths or serious injuries, while paramedics worked frantically to find any signs of life in Rebecca or her unborn child. Detective Kim began her preliminary investigation by interviewing Marcus in the living room while paramedics continued their efforts upstairs. The teenager's account was straightforward and seemed consistent with what first responders had observed. He told Detective Kim that he had been in his bedroom doing homework when he heard his mother scream and then a loud crashing sound. When he came out of his room and looked down the staircase, he found his mother at the bottom, not moving and bleeding heavily. Marcus said he had immediately called 911 and had been too frightened to approach his mother's body, worried that he might make her injuries worse if she was still alive. His story seemed plausible, and Detective Kim noted in her initial report that Marcus appeared genuinely distraught and showed appropriate emotional responses to the traumatic situation he had discovered. The paramedics worked for nearly 30 minutes attempting to revive Rebecca Caldwell, but their efforts were unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead at 11:26 that evening, and preliminary examination suggested that she had died from massive head trauma consistent with a fall down a flight of stairs. The unborn child, a girl who would have been named Emma according to family members, had also died as a result of the trauma to her mother. The scene was immediately classified as a death investigation, and the county coroner was called to examine the body and determine the exact cause of death. Detective Kim expanded the investigation to include a thorough examination of the house, looking for any signs of forced entry, struggle, or other evidence that might explain how Rebecca had come to fall down the stairs. Thomas Caldwell was reached by phone in Springfield at 11:45 that evening and was informed of his wife's death by Detective Kim. His reaction, described in the police report as one of complete shock and devastation, seemed genuine as he struggled to understand what had happened to his family. Thomas immediately left Springfield and drove through the night to return home, arriving at the house just after 2 in the morning to find it surrounded by police vehicles and crime scene tape. The sight of his home transformed into an active investigation scene, combined with the reality that his wife and unborn daughter were dead, caused Thomas to collapse in his driveway, requiring medical attention from paramedics who were still on scene processing evidence. The initial investigation focused on determining whether Rebecca's death had been accidental or if there were suspicious circumstances that warranted further scrutiny. The staircase where she was found was examined for any structural problems, loose carpeting, or other hazards that might have caused her to fall. Detective Kim noted that the stairs appeared to be in good condition, with secure railings and no obvious defects that would explain a sudden fall. The positioning of Rebecca's body, however, raised some questions for the experienced detective. While it was possible for someone to fall downstairs and land in the position where Rebecca was found, the distance her body had traveled from the base of the stairs and the pattern of blood spatter suggested that the fall might have involved more force than would typically result from simply losing one's footing. Marcus was taken to the police station for a more detailed interview, accompanied by a family friend who served as his guardian until his father could return from Springfield. The teenager's account remained consistent during this second interview, though Detective Kim noted some details that seemed unusual for someone who had just discovered his mother's body. Marcus was able to provide very specific information about the timing of events, remembering exactly what television show he had been watching when he heard the crash and being precise about how long he had waited before calling 911. While this level of detail wasn't necessarily suspicious, experienced investigators know that trauma often affects memory in ways that make such precision uncommon in genuine emergency situations. The house itself told a story that investigators were just beginning to piece together. The kitchen showed signs of dinner preparation that had been interrupted, with food still on the stove and dishes left unwashed in the sink. Rebecca's purse was found on the kitchen counter with her wallet intact, ruling out robbery as a motive if the death proved to be anything other than accidental. Her cell phone was discovered on the floor near the bottom of the stairs, its screen cracked as if it had fallen with her or been dropped during the incident. The phone's call log showed no recent activity, and there were no signs that Rebecca had been trying to contact anyone for help before her fall. Marcus's bedroom, located at the top of the stairs near where his mother would have fallen, was examined for any evidence that might shed light on the events of that evening. His homework was spread across his desk, appearing to support his claim that he had been studying when the incident occurred. His computer showed recent internet activity related to school assignments, and there were no obvious signs of disturbance in his room. However, investigators did note that Marcus's bedroom door had a clear view of the top of the staircase, making it likely that he would have seen or heard his mother if she had been moving around the upstairs area before her fall. The autopsy of Rebecca Caldwell was conducted the following day by County Medical Examiner Dr. Patricia Vance, a forensic pathologist with over 20 years of experience in determining causes of death in suspicious circumstances. Dr. Vance's preliminary findings confirmed that Rebecca had died from severe head trauma, specifically a skull fracture that had caused massive bleeding in her brain. The pattern of injuries was consistent with a fall downstairs, but Dr. Vance noted several aspects of the trauma that warranted closer examination. The force required to cause such severe skull fractures was significant, suggesting either a fall from a considerable height or impact with unusual force. Additionally, there were bruises on Rebecca's arms and shoulders that appeared to be in different stages of healing, indicating they had occurred before the night of her death. The investigation took a more serious turn when Dr. Vance discovered defensive wounds on Rebecca's hands and forearms, injuries that suggested she had tried to protect herself from an attack rather than simply falling downstairs. These wounds, combined with the unusual pattern of blood spatter found at the scene, led Dr. Vance to classify the death as suspicious pending further investigation. The medical examiner's findings were immediately shared with Detective Kim and the county prosecutor's office, transforming what had initially appeared to be a tragic accident into a potential homicide investigation. As news of Rebecca Caldwell's death spread through Millbrook Heights and the broader political community, the response was one of shock and sympathy for Thomas Caldwell and his family. Rebecca had been well known in the community for her volunteer work with local schools and her support of her husband's political career. She was remembered as a devoted mother and wife who had been excited about the upcoming birth of her daughter. The idea that her death might be anything other than a tragic accident was almost incomprehensible to those who knew the family, and the suggestion that someone might have deliberately harmed a pregnant woman sent shockwaves through the quiet suburban community. Detective Kim expanded her investigation to include interviews with family members, friends, and neighbors who might have information about the Caldwell family dynamics or any recent changes in behavior that could be relevant to Rebecca's death. The interviews painted a picture of what appeared to be a stable, loving family with no obvious problems or conflicts. Thomas was described as a dedicated public servant and family man, while Rebecca was remembered as a caring mother who had been looking forward to expanding their family. Marcus was generally described as a typical teenager, perhaps a bit quiet and reserved, but not someone who had ever shown signs of violence or serious behavioral problems. However, as Detective Kim dug deeper into the family's recent history, she began to uncover information that suggested the Caldwell household might not have been as harmonious as it appeared from the outside. Several of Marcus's teachers reported that his grades had been declining over the past year and that he had become increasingly withdrawn and moody in class. His guidance counselor mentioned that Marcus had expressed frustration about his parents' expectations and had seemed particularly upset about the upcoming arrival of his baby sister, though these concerns had been dismissed as normal teenage adjustment issues rather than warning signs of potential violence. The deeper investigation into the Caldwell family revealed troubling patterns that had been hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect suburban life. Detective Kim's interviews with extended family members and close friends began to paint a more complex picture of the household dynamics in the months leading up to Rebecca's death. Thomas Caldwell's sister, Patricia Manning, reluctantly shared that Rebecca had confided in her about increasing tension with Marcus, particularly regarding his reaction to the pregnancy. According to Patricia, Rebecca had expressed concern that Marcus seemed resentful about the baby and had made several comments about how everything would change once his sister arrived. Rebecca had mentioned that Marcus had become increasingly defiant and argumentative, especially when discussions turned to preparing the nursery or making plans for after the baby's birth. School records obtained through a court order revealed a pattern of declining academic performance and behavioral issues that Marcus's parents had apparently been trying to address privately. His sophomore year grades showed a dramatic drop from the A's and B's he had maintained throughout middle school and his freshman year. Teachers reported that Marcus had become increasingly isolated from his peers, often eating lunch alone and avoiding participation in class discussions. More concerning were reports from his physical education teacher about Marcus's reaction to a unit on child development and parenting, during which he had made disturbing comments about babies being burdens and families being better off without additional children. These comments had been reported to the school counselor, who had attempted to schedule a meeting with Rebecca and Thomas, but the meeting had been postponed multiple times due to Thomas's legislative schedule and Rebecca's pregnancy-related medical appointments. Detective Kim's examination of the family's financial records revealed another potential source of stress within the household. Despite Thomas's position as a state senator and the family's affluent lifestyle, they were carrying significant debt related to Thomas's political campaigns and had recently taken out a second mortgage on their home. Rebecca's pregnancy had required her to stop working as a substitute teacher, reducing the family's income at a time when expenses were increasing in preparation for the new baby. Bank records showed that Rebecca had been researching the costs of private schools and college savings plans, suggesting she was concerned about providing for both children's futures. There were also records of payments to a family therapist, Dr. Michael Harrison, indicating that the Caldwells had been seeking professional help for what were described in insurance claims as family adjustment issues. Dr. Harrison, when contacted by investigators, initially cited patient confidentiality but eventually provided limited information under a court order related to the death investigation. He confirmed that the family had attended several sessions over the past 6 months, primarily focused on helping Marcus adjust to the upcoming changes in the family structure. According to Dr. Harrison, Marcus had expressed feelings of being replaced by the new baby and had shown signs of what the therapist described as pathological jealousy toward his unborn sister. The sessions had been discontinued after Marcus refused to participate meaningfully, often sitting in silence or giving one-word answers to questions. Dr. Harrison had recommended individual therapy for Marcus and had suggested that the family might benefit from more intensive intervention, but these recommendations had not been followed through due to what Thomas and Rebecca described as scheduling conflicts and Marcus's resistance to treatment. The investigation took a significant turn when Detective Kim discovered that Marcus had been researching methods of causing fatal accidents in the weeks leading up to his mother's death. A forensic examination of the family computer revealed a disturbing pattern of internet searches conducted during times when Marcus would have been home alone. The searches included queries about how much force was needed to cause fatal head injuries, whether falls downstairs could be made to look accidental, and specific information about pregnancy complications that could result in fetal death. Most alarming were searches about inheritance laws and whether minors could inherit property if their parents died, suggesting that Marcus had been thinking about the financial implications of his parents' deaths as well as the emotional relief he might feel from eliminating the source of his perceived displacement. Computer forensics specialist Jennifer Torres, brought in to conduct a thorough analysis of the family's digital devices, discovered that Marcus had been using private browsing modes and deleting his search history, but had not been sophisticated enough to completely eliminate the digital trail of his research. The searches showed a progression from general curiosity about accidental deaths to specific planning for what appeared to be the murder of his mother. In the week before Rebecca's death, Marcus had searched for information about the timing of Thomas's legislative sessions, apparently ensuring that his father would be away from home when he carried out his plan. He had also researched the response times of emergency services in their area and had looked up information about how long someone could survive with severe head trauma, suggesting he was planning the timing of his 911 call to ensure that any rescue efforts would be too late to save his mother's life. The digital evidence was corroborated by physical evidence that investigators had initially overlooked in their assumption that Rebecca's death was accidental. A more thorough examination of the staircase revealed microscopic traces of blood and hair on the banister near the top of the stairs, positioned in a way that suggested Rebecca had been struck or pushed rather than simply falling. Crime scene reconstruction specialist Dr. Amanda Foster was brought in to analyze the blood spatter patterns and the positioning of Rebecca's body, using advanced forensic techniques to determine the likely sequence of events that had led to her death. Dr. Foster's analysis indicated that Rebecca had been struck at the top of the stairs with sufficient force to cause immediate disorientation, then had either fallen or been pushed down the staircase while already injured and unable to protect herself effectively. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered a journal hidden in Marcus's bedroom, concealed inside a hollowed-out textbook that had been placed among his school supplies. The journal, written in Marcus's handwriting and spanning several months leading up to the murder, provided a chilling window into his psychological state and his growing obsession with eliminating what he saw as threats to his position in the family. Early entries focused on his resentment about the pregnancy and his perception that his parents were already favoring the unborn baby over him. As the entries progressed, they became increasingly violent and specific, with Marcus writing about fantasies of his mother and the baby disappearing and detailed plans for how he might make that happen without being caught. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before the murder, read in part, "Mom keeps talking about how everything will be different when Emma gets here, how we'll all have to make sacrifices for the baby. She doesn't understand that I don't want to make sacrifices. I was here first. I should be enough for them. Sometimes I think about what would happen if something happened to her and the baby. Dad would be sad for a while, but then it would just be us again like it used to be. I've been thinking about how accidents happen all the time, especially to pregnant women. They're clumsy and off balance. It wouldn't be that hard to help an accident along." The journal entries became increasingly detailed and disturbing as Marcus worked through his plans, considering different methods and timing options before settling on the staircase scenario that he believed would be most likely to appear accidental. The final entry, written the day before the murder, demonstrated the cold calculation that had gone into Marcus's planning. "Tomorrow night Dad will be in Springfield until late. Mom always goes upstairs around 9:30 to get ready for bed. The stairs are steep and she's been having trouble with her balance lately because of the baby. If she fell from the top, especially if she hit her head on the way down, it would probably kill both of them. I would wait a few minutes before calling for help just to make sure. Then I would be the victim too, the poor son who found his mother after a terrible accident. People would feel sorry for me instead of expecting me to be excited about a baby sister I never wanted." The journal provided prosecutors with clear evidence of premeditation and specific intent, transforming the case from a suspicious death investigation into a clear-cut murder prosecution. Armed with this evidence, Detective Kim obtained a warrant for Marcus's arrest on charges of first-degree murder and fetal homicide. The arrest took place on October 15, 2015, exactly 1 month after Rebecca's death, at Millbrook Heights High School where Marcus was attending classes as if nothing had happened. The decision to arrest him at school was made to ensure his safety and to prevent any potential flight risk, though investigators noted that Marcus had shown no signs of planning to leave the area or attempting to avoid the ongoing investigation. When Detective Kim and her partner approached Marcus in the school hallway between classes, he showed no surprise or emotional reaction, simply asking if he needed to call his father before accompanying them to the police station. The arrest of a sitting state senator's son for the murder of his pregnant mother sent shockwaves through both the local community and the broader political establishment. Thomas Caldwell, who had been maintaining his legislative duties while privately grieving his wife and unborn daughter, was forced to take a leave of absence as the media attention surrounding the case intensified. The story captured national attention not only because of the political connection, but because of the young age of the accused and the particularly heinous nature of the crime. Legal experts debated whether a 15-year-old could be charged as an adult for such a serious offense, while child psychologists appeared on television programs discussing the warning signs of juvenile violence that might have been missed in Marcus's case. The formal charges against Marcus Caldwell were filed in juvenile court initially, but prosecutors immediately petitioned for the case to be transferred to adult criminal court given the severity of the charges and the evidence of premeditation. The petition cited Marcus's age, the calculated nature of the crime, his apparent understanding of the consequences of his actions, and the lack of any mental health issues that might diminish his culpability. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison, who was assigned to prosecute the case, argued that the deliberate planning involved in the murders, combined with Marcus's attempts to cover up his actions and his complete lack of remorse, demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that warranted adult prosecution despite his chronological age. The defense team, led by prominent juvenile rights attorney David Chin, fought vigorously against the transfer to adult court, arguing that no 15-year-old possessed the neurological development necessary to fully understand the implications of such serious actions. They presented expert testimony about adolescent brain development, emphasizing that the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and long-term thinking was not fully developed until the mid-20s. The defense also highlighted Marcus's lack of any previous criminal history and argued that his actions, while inexcusable, were the result of untreated psychological issues that could be addressed through the juvenile justice system's rehabilitative approach rather than the punitive focus of adult criminal court. The transfer hearing, held over 3 days in November 2015, featured testimony from forensic psychologists, juvenile justice experts, and family members who painted competing pictures of Marcus's character and potential for rehabilitation. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Marcus after his arrest, testified that while he showed signs of conduct disorder and limited empathy, these traits were not necessarily permanent in an adolescent and could potentially be addressed through intensive therapy and medication. However, Dr. Warren also acknowledged that Marcus's complete lack of remorse for his actions and his apparent pride in the sophistication of his planning were concerning indicators that suggested a more serious underlying pathology than typical teenage behavioral problems. Judge Robert Martinez, who presided over the transfer hearing, ultimately ruled that the case should be moved to adult criminal court, citing the premeditated nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the victims, and Marcus's demonstrated understanding of the wrongfulness of his actions as evidenced by his attempts to make the murders appear accidental. In his written ruling, Judge Martinez noted that while Marcus's age was a significant factor to consider, it could not excuse or diminish the calculated brutality of his actions or the devastating impact on his family and community. The ruling meant that Marcus would face the possibility of life in prison without parole if convicted, a sentence that sparked renewed debate about the appropriateness of such severe punishment for juvenile offenders. As the case moved toward trial in adult criminal court, both the prosecution and defense teams began preparing for what would become one of the most closely watched juvenile murder trials in recent memory. The prosecution's case was built around the digital evidence of Marcus's planning, the physical evidence from the crime scene, and his own journal entries that documented his progression from resentment to homicidal planning. The defense strategy focused on challenging Marcus's capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder, emphasizing his youth, his psychological vulnerabilities, and the family dynamics that had contributed to his disturbed mental state. The stage was set for a legal battle that would not only determine Marcus's fate but would also influence how the justice system handles cases involving serious violent crimes committed by very young offenders. The trial preparation phase revealed additional disturbing evidence about Marcus Caldwell's psychological state and the extent of his planning in the months leading up to the murders. Prosecutors discovered that Marcus had been conducting what could only be described as surveillance of his mother's daily routines, documenting her movements throughout the house and noting when she was most vulnerable. A notebook found in his school locker contained detailed observations about Rebecca's pregnancy-related fatigue, her difficulty navigating stairs as her pregnancy progressed, and the times when she was alone in the house. These notes, written in Marcus's careful handwriting, demonstrated a level of premeditation that went far beyond a momentary decision or teenage impulse, showing instead a methodical approach to planning his mother's death that had been developing over several months. The psychological evaluation conducted by court-appointed forensic psychiatrist Dr. Helen Rodriguez revealed a complex and deeply disturbed young man whose outward appearance of normalcy masked profound psychological dysfunction. Dr. Rodriguez's comprehensive assessment, which included multiple interviews with Marcus, psychological testing, and review of his entire developmental history, painted a picture of a teenager who had learned to mimic appropriate emotional responses while lacking genuine empathy or remorse. During their sessions, Marcus spoke about his mother's death with the same emotional tone he might use to discuss a homework assignment, showing no signs of grief, guilt, or understanding of the magnitude of what he had done. When Dr. Rodriguez asked Marcus how he felt about the fact that his actions had also killed his unborn sister, he responded with chilling indifference, saying only that it had solved two problems at once. The investigation into Marcus's school life revealed warning signs that had been overlooked or misinterpreted by teachers and administrators who were not trained to recognize the early indicators of homicidal ideation in adolescence. His English teacher, Mrs. Sarah Thompson, came forward with essays and creative writing assignments that, in retrospect, contained disturbing themes of family violence and fantasies about being an only child. One particularly troubling piece, written as part of a unit on creative fiction, described a character who eliminated family members who were preventing him from achieving his goals. The story was written with such clinical detachment and attention to detail that Mrs. Thompson had initially praised it for its sophisticated plotting, not recognizing it as a potential window into Marcus's actual thoughts and plans. Marcus's internet activity, when fully analyzed by digital forensics experts, revealed an even more extensive pattern of research into violence and murder than initially discovered. Beyond his searches about accidental deaths and head injuries, investigators found that Marcus had been visiting online forums dedicated to discussing famous murder cases, paying particular attention to cases involving family members and situations where perpetrators had successfully made murders appear accidental. He had also researched the legal system's treatment of juvenile offenders, apparently trying to understand what consequences he might face if caught, and had looked into the inheritance laws that would apply if both his parents died, suggesting that his planning may have extended beyond just eliminating his mother and unborn sister. The forensic analysis of the crime scene, conducted with the benefit of knowing that Rebecca's death was not accidental, revealed additional evidence of Marcus's careful planning and execution of the murder. Blood spatter expert Dr. Michael Foster determined that Rebecca had been struck at least twice at the top of the stairs before falling, indicating that Marcus had not simply pushed her but had actively beaten her to ensure that she would be severely injured before the fall. The pattern of blood on the walls and ceiling near the top of the staircase suggested that Marcus had used a blunt object, possibly a baseball bat that was later found cleaned and returned to his bedroom closet, to inflict the initial injuries that would have left Rebecca disoriented and unable to defend herself as she fell down the stairs. The medical examiner's more detailed autopsy findings, conducted after the case was reclassified as a homicide, revealed the full extent of Rebecca's suffering in her final moments. Dr. Patricia Vance determined that Rebecca had likely been conscious for several minutes after the initial attack, meaning she would have been aware of what was happening as she fell down the stairs and lay dying at the bottom. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms indicated that she had tried to protect herself and her unborn child, fighting desperately against her attacker even as her strength failed. Most heartbreaking was the evidence that Rebecca had attempted to crawl toward the phone after her fall, leaving a trail of blood that showed she had managed to move several feet before succumbing to her injuries, possibly while Marcus watched from the top of the stairs waiting for her to die. Thomas Caldwell's world completely collapsed as the full scope of his son's actions became clear through the investigation and trial preparation. The man who had built his political career on family values and protecting children was forced to confront the reality that his own son had brutally murdered his wife and unborn daughter. Thomas struggled with overwhelming guilt about the signs he had missed and the family therapy sessions he had allowed to be discontinued when Marcus became uncooperative. In interviews with prosecutors, Thomas revealed that he had noticed changes in Marcus's behavior over the past year but had attributed them to normal teenage development and the stress of adjusting to the upcoming arrival of a new sibling. He admitted that both he and Rebecca had been so focused on preparing for the baby and managing their busy schedules that they had not given adequate attention to Marcus's emotional needs or the warning signs of his deteriorating mental state. The community of Millbrook Heights struggled to process the reality that such a horrific crime had been committed by one of their own children, someone who had grown up among them and attended school with their own sons and daughters. Parents questioned their ability to recognize dangerous behavior in their own children, while schools implemented new protocols for identifying and reporting concerning student behavior. The case sparked intense debate about the role of mental health services in schools and the responsibility of educators to recognize and respond to warning signs of potential violence. Many residents expressed anger and betrayal, feeling that the Caldwell family's public image of success and stability had been a facade that concealed serious dysfunction and danger. If you're finding this case as shocking and disturbing as we are, please hit that like button to help us bring you more in-depth coverage of true crime cases that have shaped our understanding of juvenile violence and family dynamics. Your support helps us continue investigating these difficult but important stories. The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison, faced the challenging task of presenting evidence of such brutal violence committed by someone who appeared to be an ordinary teenager. Morrison's strategy focused on demonstrating the calculated nature of Marcus's actions and his clear understanding of right and wrong, countering the defense's anticipated arguments about his youth and psychological development. The prosecution planned to present the journal entries, computer searches, and crime scene evidence in a chronological sequence that would show the jury how Marcus had progressed from resentment to planning to execution over a period of several months. Morrison also intended to call expert witnesses who would testify about Marcus's psychological capacity and his ability to understand the consequences of his actions, arguing that his youth did not diminish his culpability for such a carefully planned and brutally executed crime. The defense team, led by David Chin, faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client whose own writings and actions provided overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Chen's strategy focused on challenging Marcus's capacity to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder, arguing that his adolescent brain development, combined with undiagnosed psychological disorders and family dysfunction, had impaired his ability to fully understand the implications of his actions. The defense planned to present extensive expert testimony about adolescent brain development, the effects of untreated mental illness on decision-making capacity, and the environmental factors that had contributed to Marcus's disturbed psychological state. Chin also intended to argue that Marcus's actions, while inexcusable, were the result of a perfect storm of developmental, psychological, and environmental factors that should mitigate his culpability and result in a sentence that focused on treatment and rehabilitation rather than purely punitive measures. The jury selection process for Marcus Caldwell's trial began in January 2016 and proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the case, as potential jurors struggled with their ability to fairly evaluate a 15-year-old defendant accused of such heinous crimes. Many prospective jurors expressed strong emotional reactions to the basic facts of the case, with some stating that they could not imagine any circumstances that would justify a child killing his pregnant mother, while others indicated that they could not support a life sentence for someone so young regardless of the crime. The final jury consisted of 12 individuals from diverse backgrounds, including parents, teachers, and professionals who convinced both legal teams that they could set aside their personal feelings and evaluate the evidence objectively according to the law. Judge Patricia Hawthorne, who would preside over the trial, implemented special procedures to accommodate the unique circumstances of prosecuting a juvenile defendant in adult court. The courtroom was modified to ensure that Marcus could see and participate in the proceedings despite his small stature, and special provisions were made for his safety and security given the high-profile nature of the case and the strong emotions it had generated in the community. Judge Hawthorne also established strict guidelines for media coverage, allowing limited access to the proceedings while protecting the privacy and dignity of all parties involved, particularly given the defendant's age and the sensitive nature of the evidence that would be presented. The opening statements in the trial of Marcus Caldwell began on February 8, 2016, in a courtroom packed with media representatives, legal observers, and family members seeking justice for Rebecca and her unborn daughter Emma. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison's opening statement methodically laid out the prosecution's case, using a timeline and visual aids to show the jury how Marcus had progressed from resentment to planning to murder over a period of several months. Morrison emphasized that while Marcus was chronologically 15 years old, his actions demonstrated a level of sophistication, planning, and understanding that warranted holding him accountable as an adult for his crimes. She told the jury that they would see evidence of a young man who knew exactly what he was doing, who planned his actions carefully to avoid detection, and who showed no remorse for destroying his own family in pursuit of his selfish desires. Defense attorney David Chen's opening statement focused on humanizing Marcus and contextualizing his actions within the framework of adolescent development and psychological dysfunction. Chen acknowledged that Marcus had killed his mother and unborn sister, but argued that the jury needed to understand the complex factors that had led to this tragedy, including his immature brain development, undiagnosed mental health issues, and the family dynamics that had contributed to his disturbed psychological state. Chen emphasized that Marcus was still a child, regardless of the adult court setting, and that his actions were the result of a developing mind that lacked the capacity for adult-level moral reasoning and impulse control. The defense attorney asked the jury to consider not just what Marcus had done, but why he had done it and whether a 15-year-old could truly be held to the same standard of accountability as an adult defendant. The prosecution's case began with testimony from the first responders who had arrived at the Caldwell home on the night of the murders, establishing the timeline of events and Marcus's behavior in the immediate aftermath of his mother's death. Officer David Martinez testified about finding Marcus in the living room, apparently in shock but providing a coherent account of discovering his mother at the bottom of the stairs. Paramedic Supervisor Janet Walsh described the scene she encountered and the unsuccessful efforts to revive Rebecca and her unborn child, painting a vivid picture of the violence that had occurred and the lives that had been lost. Detective Sarah Kim walked the jury through the initial investigation, explaining how what had first appeared to be a tragic accident had gradually revealed itself to be a carefully planned murder as evidence accumulated over the following weeks. The most damaging testimony for Marcus came from digital forensics expert Jennifer Torres, who presented the extensive evidence of his online research and planning in the months leading up to the murders. Torres methodically walked the jury through Marcus's computer searches, showing how he had researched methods of causing fatal head injuries, information about pregnancy complications, and the legal consequences for juvenile offenders. The progression of searches, displayed on a large screen for the jury to see, painted a clear picture of someone who was not acting impulsively but was carefully planning a murder and considering how to avoid consequences. Torres also presented evidence that Marcus had deleted his search history and used private browsing modes, demonstrating his awareness that his research was inappropriate and potentially incriminating. The presentation of Marcus's journal entries proved to be one of the most emotionally difficult aspects of the trial, as prosecutors read aloud his detailed fantasies about eliminating his mother and unborn sister. The journal revealed not just Marcus's resentment about the pregnancy, but his complete dehumanization of his family members and his cold calculation about the benefits he would gain from their deaths. One particularly chilling entry, written just days before the murder, described Marcus's excitement about putting his plan into action and his confidence that he would be able to convince everyone that his mother's death was a tragic accident. The journal entries were presented alongside family photos and home videos that showed the stark contrast between the loving family image the Caldwells had projected and the reality of Marcus's hidden hatred and violent intentions. Dr. Patricia Vance, the medical examiner who had conducted Rebecca's autopsy, provided detailed testimony about the extent of the injuries that had caused her death and the suffering she had endured in her final moments. Dr. Vance explained that Rebecca had been struck multiple times at the top of the stairs, causing severe head trauma that would have left her disoriented and unable to defend herself effectively as she fell. The medical examiner also testified about the defensive wounds on Rebecca's hands and arms, evidence that she had fought desperately to protect herself and her unborn child even as her strength failed. Most heartbreaking was Dr. Vance's testimony about the evidence that Rebecca had remained conscious for several minutes after her fall, attempting to crawl toward help before succumbing to her injuries while her son watched from above. The forensic evidence presented during the third week of trial painted an increasingly damning picture of Marcus's calculated approach to murdering his family. Crime scene reconstruction specialist Dr. Amanda Foster took the stand to explain her analysis of the blood spatter patterns and physical evidence found throughout the Caldwell home. Using detailed diagrams and computer-generated recreations, Dr. Foster demonstrated how the evidence contradicted any possibility that Rebecca's death had been accidental. The blood patterns on the walls and ceiling near the top of the staircase indicated that Rebecca had been struck with significant force while standing upright, causing immediate bleeding before she fell down the stairs. The trajectory analysis showed that the initial blows had been delivered from behind, suggesting that Marcus had approached his mother when she was unaware and vulnerable, possibly as she was preparing for bed as indicated in his journal entries. Dr. Foster's testimony revealed additional disturbing details about the level of violence Marcus had used against his pregnant mother. The forensic analysis indicated that after striking Rebecca at the top of the stairs, Marcus had likely pushed or thrown her down the staircase to ensure that the fall would cause fatal injuries. The positioning of Rebecca's body at the bottom of the stairs, combined with the pattern of blood and tissue found on the steps themselves, suggested that she had struck the stairs multiple times during her fall, each impact causing additional trauma to her head and body. Most chilling was Dr. Foster's conclusion that the evidence showed Marcus had remained at the top of the stairs for several minutes after his mother fell, watching as she attempted to crawl toward the phone before finally succumbing to her injuries. The prosecution's presentation of the murder weapon evidence proved particularly compelling to the jury. Investigators had initially overlooked the baseball bat found in Marcus's bedroom closet, assuming it was simply sports equipment. However, microscopic analysis revealed traces of blood and hair that matched Rebecca Caldwell, despite the bat having been thoroughly cleaned after the attack. Forensic scientist Dr. Robert Kim testified that the cleaning had been methodical and sophisticated, using bleach and other chemicals that would eliminate most evidence but had not been completely successful in removing all traces of biological material from the bat's surface. The fact that Marcus had cleaned the weapon so thoroughly demonstrated his awareness of guilt and his understanding that what he had done was wrong and punishable, directly contradicting the defense's arguments about his diminished capacity. Thomas Caldwell's testimony proved to be one of the most emotionally devastating moments of the trial, as the grieving father and widower was forced to confront the reality of his son's actions while testifying for the prosecution. Thomas, who had aged visibly in the months since his wife's death, struggled to maintain his composure as he described the family dynamics in the months leading up to the murders. He acknowledged that he and Rebecca had been concerned about Marcus's reaction to the pregnancy but had not recognized the depth of his resentment or the potential for violence. Thomas testified that Marcus had become increasingly withdrawn and argumentative, particularly when discussions turned to preparing for the baby or making plans for the future. He admitted that both he and Rebecca had been so focused on their busy schedules and preparing for the new arrival that they had not given adequate attention to Marcus's emotional needs or the warning signs of his deteriorating mental state. The most heartbreaking aspect of Thomas's testimony came when he was asked to read portions of Rebecca's diary that had been found during the investigation. Rebecca had documented her growing concerns about Marcus's behavior and his apparent resentment toward the unborn baby, writing about her attempts to include him in preparations for his sister's arrival and her frustration when he showed no interest or actively resisted participating in family activities. One entry, written just 2 weeks before her death, revealed Rebecca's fear that Marcus was becoming increasingly hostile toward her and the baby, though she had attributed his behavior to normal teenage adjustment issues rather than recognizing it as a potential threat to her safety. Rebecca had written about her hope that Marcus would come to love his sister once she was born and her determination to help him adjust to the changes in their family structure, never imagining that her efforts to include him were being interpreted as evidence of his displacement in her affections. The prosecution called Dr. Michael Harrison, the family therapist who had worked with the Caldwells in the months before the murders, to testify about his observations of Marcus's psychological state and the warning signs that had been present during their sessions. Dr. Harrison described Marcus as a deeply troubled young man who showed signs of what he termed pathological narcissism and an inability to empathize with others, particularly his family members. During therapy sessions, Marcus had expressed resentment about having to share his parents' attention and had made concerning statements about wishing he was an only child. Dr. Harrison testified that he had recommended individual therapy for Marcus and had suggested that the family might benefit from more intensive intervention, but these recommendations had not been followed through when Marcus became uncooperative and refused to participate meaningfully in the sessions. Dr. Harrison's most damaging testimony concerned a private conversation he had with Rebecca after one particularly difficult session where Marcus had refused to speak at all. Rebecca had confided her growing fear that Marcus was becoming increasingly hostile toward her and the baby, mentioning specific incidents where he had made cruel comments about the pregnancy or had deliberately tried to upset her by discussing the risks and complications that could occur during childbirth. Dr. Harrison had advised Rebecca to take Marcus's behavior seriously and had recommended that she and Thomas consider more intensive intervention, possibly including residential treatment if Marcus's behavior continued to escalate. However, the family had discontinued therapy shortly after this conversation, with Thomas later explaining that they had hoped Marcus would adjust on his own and that they had been reluctant to pursue more aggressive treatment options that might affect his academic performance or social development. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by testimony from Marcus's teachers and school counselors, who described a pattern of concerning behavior that had escalated in the months leading up to the murders. His guidance counselor, Mrs. Jennifer Walsh, testified that Marcus had been referred to her office multiple times for inappropriate comments about violence and death, including a disturbing incident where he had told a classmate that pregnant women were vulnerable and easy targets for violence. Mrs. Walsh had attempted to schedule meetings with Marcus's parents to discuss these concerns, but the meetings had been repeatedly postponed due to scheduling conflicts and had never taken place. She testified that she had documented her concerns in Marcus's school file and had recommended that he be evaluated by a school psychologist, but this recommendation had not been acted upon before the murders occurred. Marcus's English teacher, Mrs. Sarah Thompson, provided testimony about the creative writing assignments that, in retrospect, had contained clear warning signs of his violent intentions. She read portions of Marcus's essays and stories to the jury, including detailed descriptions of family violence and fantasies about eliminating family members who were perceived as obstacles to the protagonist's happiness. Mrs. Thompson testified that while she had found some of Marcus's writing disturbing, she had initially praised it for its sophisticated plotting and psychological insight, not recognizing it as a potential window into his actual thoughts and plans. She expressed deep regret about not reporting her concerns to school administrators or Marcus's parents, acknowledging that she had failed to recognize the difference between creative fiction and genuine homicidal ideation. The prosecution's presentation of Marcus's psychological evaluation results proved particularly damaging to the defense's arguments about his diminished capacity. Dr. Helen Rodriguez, the court-appointed forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Marcus after his arrest, testified that while he showed signs of personality disorders and emotional dysfunction, he clearly understood the difference between right and wrong and had demonstrated sophisticated planning abilities that contradicted claims of impaired judgment. Dr. Rodriguez described Marcus as manipulative and calculating, noting that he had attempted to present himself as a victim during their sessions while showing no genuine remorse for his actions. She testified that Marcus had spoken about the murders with the same emotional detachment he might use to describe a school project, demonstrating a profound lack of empathy that went beyond normal adolescent development. Dr. Rodriguez's most chilling testimony concerned Marcus's reaction when she asked him about his unborn sister and whether he understood that his actions had killed an innocent child who had never had the chance to live. Marcus had responded that the baby had never been real to him, just an idea that was going to ruin his life, and that eliminating her along with his mother had been efficient and practical. When Dr. Rodriguez pressed him about whether he felt any guilt or sadness about ending his sister's life before it had truly begun, Marcus had shrugged and said that he felt relieved that he would never have to deal with the problem she would have caused. This complete absence of empathy or remorse, Dr. Rodriguez testified, was not consistent with normal adolescent development or even typical conduct disorders, but suggested a more serious underlying pathology that made Marcus dangerous to others. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of cases that challenge our understanding of juvenile crime and family violence. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you these important stories that shed light on the warning signs we all need to recognize. The prosecution's case reached its climax with the presentation of Marcus's own statements and behavior following his arrest, which demonstrated his continued lack of remorse and his apparent pride in the sophistication of his planning. Detective Sarah Kim testified about Marcus's demeanor during his interrogation, describing how he had initially maintained his story about finding his mother after an accidental fall but had gradually revealed details that only the perpetrator could have known. When confronted with the physical evidence and his own journal entries, Marcus had eventually admitted to the murders but had shown no emotional reaction to discussing the deaths of his mother and unborn sister. Detective Kim testified that Marcus had seemed more concerned about the legal consequences he might face than about the lives he had taken, asking detailed questions about sentencing guidelines for juvenile offenders and whether his cooperation might result in a reduced sentence. The most disturbing aspect of Marcus's post-arrest behavior, according to Detective Kim's testimony, was his apparent expectation that others would understand and sympathize with his actions once they learned about his perceived mistreatment by his family. Marcus had expressed frustration that people were focusing on his mother's death rather than on what he saw as the injustices he had suffered, including having to share his parents' attention and being expected to welcome a new sibling. He had told investigators that he believed most people in his situation would have done the same thing, demonstrating a complete inability to understand the moral boundaries that prevent normal individuals from resorting to violence even when they feel frustrated or displaced. The prosecution concluded its case by presenting evidence of Marcus's behavior while in juvenile detention awaiting trial, which continued to demonstrate his lack of remorse and his potential danger to others. Detention facility staff testified that Marcus had shown no signs of depression, anxiety, or other emotional distress that might be expected from someone who had committed such a traumatic act against his own family. Instead, he had adapted quickly to the detention environment and had even expressed satisfaction with the individual attention he received from staff and counselors. Most concerning were reports that Marcus had made comments to other detained juveniles about the effectiveness of his methods and had offered advice about how to avoid detection when committing violent acts against family members. Dr. Patricia Vance returned to the stand to provide additional testimony about the suffering that Rebecca and her unborn daughter had endured as a result of Marcus's actions. The medical examiner explained that Rebecca's injuries would have caused excruciating pain and that she would have been fully aware of what was happening to her as she lay dying at the bottom of the stairs. Dr. Vance also testified about the development stage of the unborn baby, explaining that at 7 months gestation, Emma would have been viable outside the womb and would have had an excellent chance of survival if she had been delivered immediately after the attack. The medical examiner's testimony emphasized that Marcus's actions had not only killed his mother but had also murdered a fully formed baby who was just weeks away from being born. The prosecution's final witness was Thomas Caldwell's sister, Patricia Manning, who testified about the devastating impact of the murders on the extended family and the community. Patricia described how the family had been torn apart by Marcus's actions, with relatives struggling to understand how someone they had known and loved since birth could commit such horrific acts against his own family. She testified about the ongoing trauma experienced by family members who had trusted Marcus and had never suspected that he was capable of violence, and about the guilt they felt for not recognizing the warning signs that might have prevented the tragedy. Patricia's emotional testimony provided the jury with a powerful reminder of the human cost of Marcus's actions and the ripple effects of violence that extend far beyond the immediate victims. As the prosecution rested its case, the evidence against Marcus Caldwell appeared overwhelming and virtually incontrovertible. The combination of physical evidence, digital forensics, psychological evaluations, and witness testimony had painted a clear picture of a calculated and cold-blooded murder committed by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. The prosecution had successfully demonstrated that Marcus's youth did not diminish his culpability for his actions and that his sophisticated planning and complete lack of remorse warranted the most serious consequences available under the law. The defense team now faced the nearly impossible task of convincing the jury that their client deserved mercy despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the horrific nature of his crimes. The defense team's case began with an uphill battle against overwhelming evidence, but attorney David Chen was determined to present a comprehensive picture of the factors that had contributed to Marcus's actions, hoping to convince the jury that a 15-year-old, regardless of his crimes, deserved a chance at rehabilitation rather than a life sentence. Chen's opening witness was Dr. Margaret Stevens, a leading expert in adolescent brain development and juvenile psychology, who took the stand to explain the scientific evidence about how teenage brains function differently from adult brains. Dr. Stevens presented detailed neuroimaging studies and research data showing that the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for impulse control, moral reasoning, and understanding long-term consequences, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. She explained that this biological reality meant that even highly intelligent teenagers like Marcus could not be expected to demonstrate the same level of judgment and self-control as adults, regardless of their apparent sophistication in other areas. Dr. Stevens testified that adolescents are neurologically predisposed to make decisions based on immediate emotional responses rather than careful consideration of long-term consequences, and that they are particularly vulnerable to developing distorted thinking patterns when under stress or experiencing psychological trauma. She explained that Marcus's ability to plan and execute the murders did not contradict the scientific evidence about adolescent brain development, as teenagers can demonstrate sophisticated cognitive abilities in some areas while remaining severely impaired in others, particularly those related to moral reasoning and empathy. Dr. Stevens emphasized that the teenage brain's immaturity was not an excuse for criminal behavior, but it was a crucial factor that should be considered when determining appropriate consequences and treatment options for juvenile offenders. Under cross-examination by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison, Dr. Stevens was forced to acknowledge that brain development exists on a spectrum and that some adolescents demonstrate greater maturity and self-control than others of the same chronological age. Morrison pressed the expert on how she reconciled her general statements about teenage brain development with the specific evidence of Marcus's methodical planning, his research into legal consequences, and his attempts to cover up his crimes. Dr. Stevens maintained that these behaviors, while sophisticated, were not inconsistent with adolescent brain development, as teenagers could demonstrate advanced cognitive abilities in some areas while remaining impaired in others. However, she was forced to admit that Marcus's level of planning and his apparent understanding of moral and legal boundaries suggested a higher level of development than might be typical for his age group. The defense called Dr. James Patterson, a forensic psychiatrist who had conducted an independent evaluation of Marcus, to provide an alternative perspective on his psychological state and capacity for rehabilitation. Dr. Patterson testified that while Marcus clearly suffered from serious psychological disorders, including conduct disorder and narcissistic personality traits, these conditions were not necessarily permanent in an adolescent and could potentially be addressed through intensive therapy and medication. He explained that personality disorders in teenagers were often the result of environmental factors, genetic predisposition, and developmental trauma, and that with appropriate treatment, young people could learn to develop empathy, impulse control, and moral reasoning skills that they had not naturally acquired during their early development. Dr. Patterson's testimony focused heavily on the family dynamics that had contributed to Marcus's psychological dysfunction, arguing that the Caldwell household had inadvertently created conditions that fostered his narcissistic tendencies and his inability to cope with perceived threats to his status. He testified that Marcus had been raised as an only child for 15 years, receiving undivided parental attention and developing an inflated sense of his own importance within the family structure. When Rebecca became pregnant, Marcus perceived this as an existential threat to his identity and his relationship with his parents, triggering a psychological crisis that his immature brain was unable to process in a healthy way. Dr. Patterson argued that Marcus's actions, while inexcusable, were the result of a perfect storm of psychological vulnerability, environmental stressors, and neurological immaturity that had created a temporary state of diminished capacity. The defense presented testimony from several of Marcus's former teachers and coaches who described him as a bright, capable student who had shown no previous signs of violence or serious behavioral problems. His middle school principal, Dr. Robert Chin, testified that Marcus had been an honor roll student who participated in school activities and had never been disciplined for aggressive behavior or threats against other students. His soccer coach, Michael Torres, described Marcus as a dedicated team player who had shown leadership qualities and had been well liked by his teammates. These witnesses painted a picture of a young man who had functioned normally in most social situations and had only begun to show concerning behavior in the specific context of his family relationships and the stress surrounding his mother's pregnancy. The defense's most compelling witness was Dr. Lisa Martinez, a specialist in family therapy and adolescent psychology who had reviewed the Caldwell family's history and had identified numerous factors that had contributed to Marcus's psychological dysfunction. Dr. Martinez testified that the family had unknowingly created what she termed a perfect storm of conditions that had fostered Marcus's narcissistic tendencies and his inability to cope with change. She explained that Marcus had been raised with excessive praise and attention, had never been required to share parental resources with siblings, and had developed an unrealistic sense of his own importance within the family structure. When faced with the prospect of sharing his parents' attention with a new baby, Marcus had experienced what Dr. Martinez described as a narcissistic injury that had triggered his violent response. Dr. Martinez's testimony revealed that the Caldwell family's approach to parenting, while well-intentioned, had inadvertently contributed to Marcus's psychological problems. Thomas and Rebecca had focused heavily on Marcus's academic and extracurricular achievements, providing constant praise and attention for his successes while failing to teach him how to cope with disappointment, frustration, or competition for resources. The family had also avoided conflict and had not established clear boundaries or consequences for inappropriate behavior, allowing Marcus to develop a sense of entitlement and an expectation that his needs would always be prioritized. Dr. Martinez argued that these parenting patterns, combined with Marcus's genetic predisposition to personality disorders, had created a young man who was psychologically unprepared to handle the normal challenges and disappointments of life. The defense presented evidence about Marcus's academic performance and social functioning in an attempt to demonstrate that he was capable of rehabilitation and could potentially become a productive member of society with appropriate treatment. His school records showed that despite his psychological problems, Marcus had maintained good grades and had participated in extracurricular activities, suggesting that he possessed the intellectual capacity and social skills necessary for successful rehabilitation. The defense argued that Marcus's ability to function normally in most areas of his life indicated that his violent behavior was specific to his family relationships and the particular stressors he had experienced, rather than evidence of a generalized antisocial personality that could not be treated. Dr. Patterson returned to the stand to present a detailed treatment plan that he argued could address Marcus's psychological problems and reduce his risk of future violence. The plan included intensive individual therapy focused on developing empathy and moral reasoning skills, family therapy to address the dysfunctional patterns that had contributed to his problems, medication to address his mood and impulse control issues, and ongoing monitoring and support to ensure his continued progress. Dr. Patterson testified that while Marcus's crimes were serious and his psychological problems were significant, he was still young enough that his personality and behavior patterns could be modified through appropriate intervention. He argued that sentencing Marcus to life in prison would eliminate any possibility of rehabilitation and would represent a failure of the justice system to recognize the unique characteristics and needs of juvenile offenders. The defense called several expert witnesses to testify about the effectiveness of rehabilitation programs for juvenile offenders, even those who had committed serious violent crimes. Dr. Susan Walsh, a researcher who had studied long-term outcomes for juvenile murderers, testified that young people who received intensive treatment and supervision had significantly lower rates of reoffending than those who were simply incarcerated without treatment. She presented data showing that even juveniles who had committed homicides could be successfully rehabilitated if they received appropriate intervention during their adolescent and young adult years, when their brains were still developing and their personality patterns were still malleable. Dr. Walsh's testimony challenged the prosecution's argument that Marcus represented a permanent danger to society who could never be safely released. She explained that the adolescent brain's plasticity meant that young offenders had a greater capacity for change than adult criminals, and that the justice system's focus should be on providing treatment and rehabilitation rather than purely punitive measures. Dr. Walsh acknowledged that not all juvenile offenders could be successfully rehabilitated, but she argued that Marcus's intelligence, his lack of previous criminal history, and his ability to function normally in most social situations suggested that he had a good prognosis for treatment if he received appropriate intervention. The defense's presentation of Marcus's family history revealed additional factors that had contributed to his psychological dysfunction and his inability to cope with the stress of his mother's pregnancy. Testimony from extended family members revealed that both Thomas and Rebecca had struggled with their own psychological issues, including depression and anxiety, which had affected their parenting abilities and their capacity to recognize and address Marcus's developing problems. Thomas's sister, Patricia Manning, testified that the family had a history of mental health issues that had never been adequately addressed, and that Marcus had likely inherited genetic predispositions that had made him more vulnerable to developing personality disorders and violent behavior. The defense presented evidence that Marcus had experienced what could be characterized as emotional neglect during his early childhood, despite his parents' good intentions and their efforts to provide for his material needs. Dr. Martinez testified that Thomas and Rebecca had been so focused on their careers and their public image that they had failed to provide Marcus with the emotional support and guidance he needed to develop healthy coping mechanisms and moral reasoning skills. She explained that children who do not receive adequate emotional nurturing during their early years often develop attachment disorders and narcissistic traits that can persist into adolescence and adulthood if not addressed through appropriate treatment. If you're interested in learning more about the complex factors that contribute to juvenile violence and the ongoing debate about rehabilitation versus punishment for young offenders, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of cases that challenge our understanding of criminal justice and child development. The defense's most controversial strategy involved presenting Marcus himself as a witness in his own defense, despite the significant risks involved in putting a teenage murder defendant on the stand. David Chin had spent months preparing Marcus for his testimony, working to help him understand the gravity of his situation and the importance of showing genuine remorse for his actions. However, Marcus's appearance on the witness stand proved to be a disaster for the defense, as his testimony revealed the same lack of empathy and remorse that had characterized his behavior throughout the investigation and trial preparation. When asked about his feelings regarding his mother's death, Marcus responded with clinical detachment, describing the events as if he were discussing a school project rather than the murder of his own family members. Marcus's testimony provided the jury with direct insight into his psychological state and his understanding of his actions, but it did not support the defense's arguments about his diminished capacity or his potential for rehabilitation. When Chin asked Marcus if he understood that his actions had permanently ended his mother's life and had killed his unborn sister, Marcus responded that he understood the physical facts but did not seem to grasp the emotional or moral dimensions of what he had done. He described feeling relieved that the problems caused by his mother's pregnancy had been resolved, and he expressed frustration that people were focusing on his mother's death rather than on what he perceived as the injustices he had suffered. Marcus's testimony revealed a young man who remained focused on his own perceived victimization rather than on the harm he had caused to others. The cross-examination of Marcus by Assistant District Attorney Morrison proved devastating to the defense's case, as the prosecutor methodically exposed the calculated nature of his planning and his complete lack of genuine remorse. Morrison walked Marcus through his journal entries, his computer searches, and his detailed planning for the murders, forcing him to acknowledge that he had understood the wrongfulness of his actions and had taken deliberate steps to avoid detection. When Morrison asked Marcus if he felt sorry for killing his mother and unborn sister, his response sent a chill through the courtroom. He said that he felt sorry that people were upset about it, but that he did not regret his actions because they had solved his problems. This testimony effectively destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for Marcus and reinforced the prosecution's argument that he was a dangerous individual who lacked the capacity for genuine remorse or rehabilitation. The defense's closing argument represented Chen's final attempt to convince the jury that Marcus deserved a sentence that focused on treatment and rehabilitation rather than purely punitive measures. Chen acknowledged that Marcus had committed horrific crimes and that his lack of remorse was deeply troubling, but he argued that these factors were evidence of his psychological dysfunction rather than proof that he could never be rehabilitated. Chen emphasized Marcus's youth and the scientific evidence about adolescent brain development, arguing that no 15-year-old should be sentenced to life in prison regardless of the severity of their crimes. He urged the jury to consider the possibility that Marcus could be successfully treated and could eventually become a productive member of society if he received appropriate intervention during his formative years. Chen's closing argument also focused on the systemic failures that had contributed to the tragedy, including the family's inability to recognize and address Marcus's psychological problems, the school system's failure to respond appropriately to warning signs, and the mental health system's inadequate resources for treating troubled adolescents. He argued that sentencing Marcus to life in prison would not bring back Rebecca and Emma Caldwell, but would represent a failure of society to take responsibility for the factors that had contributed to the tragedy and to provide appropriate treatment for a seriously disturbed young person. Chen concluded by asking the jury to find Marcus guilty of a lesser charge that would acknowledge the severity of his actions while recognizing his youth and his potential for rehabilitation with appropriate treatment and supervision. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by Assistant District Attorney Morrison, systematically dismantled the defense's arguments and reinforced the evidence of Marcus's guilt and his lack of potential for rehabilitation. Morrison reminded the jury of the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, including Marcus's journal entries, his computer searches, and his methodical planning over several months. She emphasized that Marcus's actions had not been the result of a momentary lapse in judgment or an impulsive teenage decision, but had been the product of careful calculation and deliberate intent to kill his mother and unborn sister. Morrison argued that Marcus's youth did not excuse or diminish his culpability for such carefully planned and brutally executed murders, and that his complete lack of remorse demonstrated that he remained a danger to society who could not be safely rehabilitated or released. Morrison's closing argument concluded with a powerful reminder of the victims whose lives had been cut short by Marcus's selfish actions. She described Rebecca Caldwell as a loving mother and wife who had been excited about the birth of her daughter and who had died in terror and pain at the hands of her own son. She spoke about Emma Caldwell, the unborn baby who had never had the chance to take her first breath or experience the love of her family because her brother had decided that her existence was inconvenient to his desires. Morrison argued that justice for Rebecca and Emma required holding Marcus fully accountable for his actions and ensuring that he could never again harm innocent people who trusted and loved him. She urged the jury to find Marcus guilty of first-degree murder and to recommend a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, arguing that anything less would be a betrayal of the victims and a failure to protect society from a dangerous individual who had shown no capacity for genuine remorse or rehabilitation. The jury deliberations in the case of Marcus Caldwell began on March 15, 2019, after 4 years of legal proceedings that had captivated the nation and sparked intense debate about juvenile justice, family violence, and the capacity for rehabilitation among young offenders who commit the most serious crimes. The 12 jurors, who had listened to weeks of testimony about the brutal murders of Rebecca and Emma Caldwell, faced the difficult task of determining not only Marcus's guilt but also the appropriate consequences for a crime that had shocked even experienced legal professionals. The jury room was equipped with all the evidence that had been presented during the trial, including Marcus's journal entries, his computer search history, crime scene photographs, and the detailed forensic analysis that had revealed the calculated nature of his actions. The deliberations proved to be emotionally challenging for the jurors, many of whom were parents themselves and struggled with the concept of a child murdering his own pregnant mother. Jury foreman Robert Martinez, a high school teacher with over 20 years of experience working with adolescents, later described the deliberations as the most difficult experience of his life, as the jurors grappled with the overwhelming evidence of Marcus's guilt while also considering his youth and the possibility that he might be capable of rehabilitation. The jury requested several readbacks of testimony, focusing particularly on the expert witnesses who had testified about adolescent brain development and the potential for treating juvenile offenders who had committed violent crimes. On the morning of March 18, after 3 full days of deliberations, the jury notified Judge Patricia Hawthorne that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, legal observers, and family members as Marcus was brought in to hear the decision that would determine the rest of his life. Thomas Caldwell, who had aged dramatically during the 4 years since his wife's murder, sat in the front row with his sister Patricia, both of them struggling to maintain their composure as they prepared to hear whether justice would be served for Rebecca and Emma. Marcus himself showed no visible emotion as he sat between his attorneys, his expression remaining blank and detached even as the gravity of the moment settled over the courtroom. Judge Hawthorne called the court to order and asked the jury foreman to deliver the verdict. Robert Martinez stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he held the paper that contained the jury's decision. The courtroom fell completely silent as Martinez began to speak, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the decision they had reached. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Rebecca Caldwell, we find the defendant, Marcus Caldwell, guilty. The words hung in the air for a moment before Martinez continued. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Emma Caldwell, we find the defendant, Marcus Caldwell, guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom as the full impact of the verdict became clear, with several family members breaking down in tears while Marcus remained motionless at the defense table. Judge Hawthorne thanked the jury for their service and scheduled the sentencing hearing for the following month, giving both legal teams time to prepare their arguments about the appropriate punishment for Marcus's crimes. The guilty verdict on both counts of first-degree murder meant that Marcus faced the possibility of life in prison without parole, a sentence that would effectively end any chance of him ever being released from custody. The defense team immediately announced their intention to appeal the verdict, arguing that the trial court had erred in allowing Marcus to be tried as an adult and that the evidence of his psychological dysfunction should have resulted in a lesser conviction that recognized his diminished capacity due to his youth and mental health issues. The sentencing hearing began on April 22, 2019, with both the prosecution and defense presenting extensive arguments about the appropriate punishment for Marcus's crimes. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Morrison argued that the brutal nature of the murders, combined with Marcus's complete lack of remorse and his continued danger to society, warranted the maximum sentence allowed under law. Morrison presented victim impact statements from family members and friends who described the devastating effect of Rebecca and Emma's deaths on their loved ones and their community. Thomas Caldwell, speaking publicly for the first time since his son's arrest, delivered an emotional statement in which he described the destruction of his family and his struggle to understand how the son he had raised and loved could have committed such horrific acts against his own mother and unborn sister. Thomas's victim impact statement proved to be one of the most powerful moments of the entire legal proceedings, as he spoke directly to the court about the loss of his wife and daughter and the additional trauma of knowing that their deaths had been caused by his own son. "Rebecca was the love of my life and the heart of our family," Thomas said, his voice breaking with emotion. She was excited about becoming a mother again and had so many plans for Emma's future. Marcus didn't just kill his mother and sister that night, he destroyed our entire family and left me with nothing but grief and questions that will never be answered. Thomas went on to describe his ongoing struggle with guilt about the warning signs he had missed and his failure to protect his wife and unborn daughter from the son they had both loved and trusted. The defense team's sentencing argument focused on Marcus's youth and the possibility that he could be rehabilitated through intensive treatment and supervision rather than being warehoused in the prison system for the rest of his life. David Chin presented testimony from additional mental health experts who argued that Marcus's psychological problems could potentially be addressed through long-term therapy and medication, and that sentencing him to life without parole would eliminate any incentive for him to participate in treatment or to develop the empathy and moral reasoning skills he currently lacked. Chin argued that while Marcus's crimes were inexcusable, the justice system's focus should be on protecting society while also providing opportunities for rehabilitation, particularly for juvenile offenders whose brains were still developing and whose personality patterns were not yet permanently fixed. Dr. Lisa Martinez returned to testify during the sentencing hearing, presenting a detailed treatment plan that she argued could address Marcus's psychological dysfunction and reduce his risk of future violence. The plan included decades of intensive individual therapy, family therapy to address the systemic issues that had contributed to his problems, medication management for his mood and impulse control issues, and ongoing monitoring and evaluation to assess his progress and his continued risk to society. Dr. Martinez acknowledged that the treatment would be expensive and time-consuming, and that there were no guarantees of success, but she argued that Marcus's youth and intelligence gave him a better prognosis for rehabilitation than many adult offenders who had committed similar crimes. The prosecution's response to the defense's rehabilitation arguments was swift and decisive, with Morrison presenting evidence that Marcus had shown no progress or improvement during his 4 years in juvenile detention awaiting trial. Detention facility staff testified that Marcus had adapted well to the institutional environment but had shown no signs of developing empathy, remorse, or understanding of the impact of his actions on others. He had participated in required counseling sessions but had approached them as intellectual exercises rather than opportunities for genuine self-reflection and growth. Most concerning were reports that Marcus had continued to express satisfaction with his actions and had made comments to other detained juveniles about the effectiveness of his methods for eliminating family problems. Dr. Helen Rodriguez, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Marcus multiple times throughout the legal proceedings, provided updated testimony about his psychological state and his potential for rehabilitation. Dr. Rodriguez reported that Marcus had shown no meaningful change in his personality or his understanding of his actions during the 4 years since his arrest, and that he continued to demonstrate the same lack of empathy and remorse that had characterized his behavior immediately after the murders. She testified that while some juvenile offenders could be successfully rehabilitated, Marcus's particular combination of narcissistic traits, lack of empathy, and absence of genuine remorse suggested a poor prognosis for treatment, regardless of his chronological age or the resources devoted to his rehabilitation. The sentencing hearing also included testimony from experts in juvenile justice and criminal psychology who debated the broader implications of the case for how society should handle young offenders who commit the most serious crimes. Some experts argued that Marcus's case demonstrated the need for more flexible sentencing options that could provide long-term treatment and supervision while still protecting society from dangerous individuals. Others maintained that certain crimes were so heinous and demonstrated such a complete absence of moral development that age should not be a mitigating factor in determining appropriate punishment. The debate reflected broader societal questions about the purpose of the criminal justice system and whether it should focus primarily on punishment, rehabilitation, or public safety. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you want to stay updated on how this landmark case influenced juvenile justice policies and continue following cases that challenge our understanding of crime, punishment, and the possibility of redemption for even the youngest offenders. Judge Patricia Hawthorne spent several weeks reviewing all the evidence and arguments presented during the trial and sentencing hearing before announcing her decision on May 10, 2019. The courtroom was once again packed with observers as Judge Hawthorne prepared to deliver a sentence that would not only determine Marcus's fate but would also send a message about how society should respond to juvenile offenders who commit the most serious crimes. Judge Hawthorne began her remarks by acknowledging the difficulty of the decision she faced and the competing interests that had to be balanced in determining an appropriate sentence for such an unprecedented case. This court has carefully considered all the evidence presented during this trial, including the testimony of numerous expert witnesses, the victim impact statements, and the arguments of both the prosecution and defense regarding the appropriate sentence for these crimes. Judge Hawthorne began. The court recognizes that the defendant was 15 years old at the time of these murders and that his youth is a significant factor that must be considered in determining an appropriate sentence. However, the court also recognizes that the crimes committed by Marcus Caldwell were not the result of impulsive teenage behavior or a momentary lapse in judgment, but were the product of months of careful planning and deliberate intent to kill his mother and unborn sister. Judge Hawthorne continued by addressing the evidence of Marcus's psychological state and his potential for rehabilitation, acknowledging the expert testimony about adolescent brain development while also considering the specific evidence about Marcus's personality and his response to treatment attempts. The court has heard extensive testimony about the defendant's psychological condition and the possibility that he could be rehabilitated through intensive treatment and supervision, Judge Hawthorne stated. However, the court has also heard evidence that the defendant has shown no genuine remorse for his actions, no meaningful progress in developing empathy or moral reasoning skills, and no indication that he understands the true impact of his crimes on his victims and their loved ones. The court finds that the defendant's complete absence of remorse, combined with his continued satisfaction with his actions, suggests that he remains a significant danger to society regardless of his chronological age. The judge then addressed the broader implications of the case and the message that the sentence would send about society's response to juvenile violence. While this court recognizes the importance of rehabilitation and the unique characteristics of juvenile offenders, it also recognizes that certain crimes are so heinous and demonstrate such a complete absence of moral development that they warrant the most serious consequences available under law, Judge Hawthorne explained. The brutal murder of a pregnant woman by her own son represents a level of depravity that cannot be excused or diminished by the perpetrator's youth, particularly when that perpetrator has shown no capacity for genuine remorse or rehabilitation. Judge Hawthorne's final remarks focused on the victims whose lives had been cut short by Marcus's actions and the need to ensure that justice was served for Rebecca and Emma Caldwell. Rebecca Caldwell was a loving mother, wife, and member of this community who was brutally murdered by someone she trusted and loved, Judge Hawthorne stated. Emma Caldwell was an innocent child who never had the opportunity to experience life because her brother decided that her existence was inconvenient to his desires. These victims deserve justice, and their memory deserves to be honored by ensuring that their killer is held fully accountable for his actions and can never again harm innocent people who trust and love him. With those words, Judge Hawthorne delivered the sentence that would seal Marcus Caldwell's fate. This court sentences Marcus Caldwell to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Rebecca Caldwell, and to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Emma Caldwell, these sentences to run concurrently. The defendant will be transferred to the state correctional system to begin serving his sentence immediately, and he will remain in custody for the remainder of his natural life. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the packed courtroom, bringing to a close one of the most shocking and disturbing cases in recent memory. The reaction to Marcus's sentence was swift and divided, with victims' rights advocates praising the decision as appropriate justice for such heinous crimes, while juvenile justice advocates criticized it as an abandonment of the principles of rehabilitation and redemption that should guide the treatment of young offenders. Thomas Caldwell issued a brief statement expressing his satisfaction with the sentence and his hope that it would provide some measure of closure for his family and community. The defense team immediately filed notice of their intention to appeal both the conviction and the sentence, arguing that the trial court had committed reversible error in allowing Marcus to be tried as an adult and in imposing such a severe sentence on a juvenile offender. Marcus himself showed no visible reaction to the sentence, maintaining the same blank expression that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial proceedings. As he was led away from the courtroom in shackles, he did not look back at his father or acknowledge the family members who had supported him throughout the legal process. Corrections officials reported that Marcus adapted quickly to the adult prison environment and showed no signs of distress about his life sentence, approaching his incarceration with the same detached acceptance that had marked his response to his arrest and trial. The case of Marcus Caldwell became a landmark in juvenile justice law, influencing legislation and court decisions about the prosecution and sentencing of young offenders who commit serious violent crimes. Legal scholars and criminal justice experts continue to debate the appropriateness of life sentences for juvenile offenders, with some arguing that Marcus's case demonstrated the need for such severe sentences in exceptional circumstances, while others maintain that no child should be sentenced to die in prison regardless of their crimes. The case also sparked renewed attention to the warning signs of juvenile violence and the importance of early intervention and treatment for troubled young people before their problems escalate to dangerous levels. The legacy of Rebecca and Emma Caldwell lived on through the Thomas Caldwell Foundation, established by Marcus's father to support programs focused on preventing family violence and providing mental health services for at-risk youth. Thomas dedicated the remainder of his life to advocating for better recognition and treatment of the warning signs that can lead to juvenile violence, hoping that his family's tragedy might prevent similar losses for other families. The Foundation's work served as a reminder that behind every shocking crime are real people whose lives were cut short and families whose worlds were forever changed by acts of senseless violence. As Marcus Caldwell began serving his life sentence in the state correctional system, the questions raised by his case continued to challenge our understanding of juvenile crime, family violence, and the capacity for redemption among even the youngest offenders. His story served as a stark reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places and that the warning signs of violence must be taken seriously before they escalate into tragedy. The case would be studied for years to come by legal professionals, mental health experts, and criminal justice researchers seeking to understand how a 15-year-old boy could plan and execute the murder of his own pregnant mother, and what society could do to prevent such horrific crimes in the future. The final chapter of this tragic story was written not in the courtroom, but in the ongoing efforts of those who had been touched by the case to ensure that Rebecca and Emma Caldwell's deaths would not be in vain. Their memory lived on through the work of advocates, researchers, and family members who continued to fight for better understanding and prevention of juvenile violence, hoping that future tragedies might be prevented through early recognition of warning signs and appropriate intervention for troubled young people before their problems escalated beyond the point of no return.